The Bar Kokhba revolt was the revolt of the Jewish people located in Judea against the authority of the Roman Empire, led by Simon Bar Kokhba. This severe threat to the empire's authority was met with such harsh suppression that it held significance in the history of Judaism.
From the 1st century BC, the Roman Empire had imperial control of Judea. Although there were periods of peace and assimilation during Roman control, by the 1st century AD, political and religious tensions grew, resulting in the First Jewish-Roman War from 66 to 73 AD. The failed conflict resulted in the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem, the religious, social and cultural heart of Judaism. This was the catalyst for the development of Rabbinic Judaism that has been the mainstream form of worship for Jews since the 6th century.
The ongoing tensions and grief from the First Jewish-Roman War continue to resonate with the Jewish people. By 132 AD, Judea saw another conflict between the Romans and the Jews, which exploded into a 3-year war.
Although the causes of the Bar Kokhba revolt are still highly debated among scholars, the memory and tension of the First Jewish-Roman War was clearly a factor. Other causes may lie in the consolidation policies of Emperor Hadrian. It seems that Hadrian may have announced his plans for the development of a new Roman colony, Aelia Capitolina, and the building of the new pagan temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
Another cause igniting great debate is the ban on circumcision enforced by Emperor Hadrian. Circumcision was a practice popular among Jews, seen as a symbol of the covenant between the Jewish people and their God.
However, there is insufficient evidence to suggest if the ban was a cause or result of the revolt. There is evidence of a clear anti-Jewish presence within the majority of Roman writings about Jews, including a stigma attached to the practice of circumcision. An example of this is recorded within the writings of Tacitus, a Roman senator and historian. Tacitus' anti-Jewish stance was very apparent. He saw circumcision not as a religious practice, but as an ethnic marker that the Jews used to separate themselves from integrating with Roman society. Unfortunately, Tacitus' view was shared among many Romans, highlighting the lack of understanding there was for Jewish customs.
The Jewish desire for an independent state of Israel was fulfilled during the early stages of the revolt, which was successful. Bar Kokhba's early military successes caused some to view him as the Messiah.
Ultimately, the heavy hand of the Roman Empire came to bear on the rebels. A force 6 legions strong finally suppressed the revolt in 135 AD. Bar Kokhba and the rebels were killed, exiled and enslaved, and Jerusalem became Aelia Capitolina.
But how was Simon Bar Kokhba and the revolt he led remembered? The Jewish people have been tragically persecuted and oppressed since. From early modern Spain to the 20th century, we'll look at different ways that the Jews have remembered the leader of the Bar Kokhba revolt, especially in times of strife, and how the images of the leader have developed over time. Some call him the son of lies, some the son of a star. This is the legend of Bar Kokhba.
The rabbi's attitude towards the Bar Kokhba revolt was, on the whole, negative. It is only Rabbi Akiva and some of his followers that gave Bar Kokhba status of the son of the star and the position of the Messiah, which a contemporary of his told him was waiting for grass to grow on your face, because he totally discounted Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. And in respect of the rabbinic literature following the revolt, it spoke of the revolt and Bar Kokhba in very negative terms, referring to Bar Kokhba as Bar Kokhba, a falsehood, a liar. And the consequences for Judaism were drastic. Thus, the way that, if at all, it influenced rabbinic literature was to pursue a course of wariness in respect of those that were in the position of control and ruler, in respect of the Middle East itself, Jews having been expelled from Judea, the immediate consequence in the Talmud and Jewish literature was to refer to the revolt in allegorical terms and to be very wary of not wishing to offend the Romans. It is only in modern times, and I'm talking of the 19th century and the growth of Zionism, that a more positive view was taken of Bar Kokhba.
In the aftermath of a devastating war, it's no surprise that the rabbinic stories took to effectively blaming Bar Kokhba for its failure. But before we look closer at the rabbinic stories, it is important to address a problem of historicity. The stories tell a highly mythologized version of the events, and thus we should look at them as religious literature, not historical fact. Further to that, for many people across the world, these stories, the oral tradition, are the living basis of their religion. This does not reduce its usefulness to us in a historical sense, as myth, legend and literature can tell us much about the mindset of a people and what they wish to convey. Rabbi Zalman Lewis and Ivor Weintraub gave us a brief explanation of how this works.
There are a number of verses in the Torah which are interpreted in Jewish tradition, by the rabbinical tradition, as being a clear message from the Torah that rabbinic tradition is a biblical obligation to recognize. And there's an amazing saying from the Talmud that every single teaching that a diligent student will teach was all given by Moses at Mount Sinai. Now the term diligent is quite specific, and it's understood in rabbinic tradition that means somebody who's true to the process of rabbinic tradition as it flows. So there's room for poetic license quite extensively. Rabbinic tradition is really colorful. 2 Jews, 16 opinions, even though everyone else says 3 opinions, but I say 16. It's very colorful. There's huge amount of debates, but it's always emphasized by this point of the diligent student. Is there a chain of basis that allows the interpretation of poetic license to be based on something?
And the rabbis will say that the basic tenets of Judaism in the 5 books of Moses are the 613 commandments known as mitzvot, that are things that Jews have to perform and do. And the rabbis have commented in the Talmud, the Mishnah, and all other rabbinic literature, have interpreted and expanded on the original written law, which has become the oral law. And in your terms, as you framed, the oral tradition. But that is merely commentary on the basic commandments in the Old Testament.
2 legends come to us in the Jerusalem Talmud and the Midrash Lamentations. The 2 stories are essentially the same, although the Jerusalem Talmud tells a slightly more dramatic version of events. The first story goes as this. Bar Kokhba's soldiers are surrounded in Batar, their stronghold, by 80,000 Roman soldiers. But the rebel forces are incredibly strong. Bar Kokhba has tested each of them by making them cut off a finger and uproot a cedar tree. He goes to battle with a prayer to God to neither help nor shame us. The siege of Batar lasts 3.5 years, during which time Rabbi Elazar sits in ash and sackcloth and prays to God to not sit in judgment today. Just as Hadrian is about to give up, a Cathian, another word for the Samaritans, offers to help trick the rebels. He pretends to be mutinously whispering in the ear of Rabbi Elazar, and the loyal rebels take the Cathian to Bar Kokhba. The Cathian lies and says that the Rabbi Elazar was telling him to surrender the city. Bar Kokhba, furious at this mutiny, questions Rabbi Elazar, who of course denies all knowledge. In a rage, Bar Kokhba kills the innocent Rabbi Elazar with a single kick. As divine punishment, Batar is immediately captured, and Bar Kokhba is killed. His head is brought to Hadrian, and the Cathian claims to have killed him. However, upon closer inspection of the body, Hadrian finds a snake wrapped around it. Hadrian, in what is effectively Bar Kokhba's eulogy, claims that God himself has killed him, because who else would have been capable of doing so? Let's unpick this story a little bit. Firstly, it is obvious to us that these stories portray Bar Kokhba as a figure of immense talent and skill, and his army are extremely powerful. He is able to kill Rabbi Elazar with just one kick, and Hadrian acknowledges that only God could have killed him. This depiction of Bar Kokhba as a legendary biblical military hero recalls figures such as Samson, Abner, Job, and the sons of Jacob, who all possess a similar, incredible strength. Samson could uproot 2 mountains and grind them to dust, and travel huge distances with a single step. A wall 11 feet high and thick would be easier to move than one of Abner's feet.
You can go on. The Old Testament is full of military heroes, starting with Moses. With his right arm in the air, the Jews were successful. Immediately he got tired. The battle seemed to go the other way, so they held up his arm in the end. Like everybody, military heroes, like every nation in fact, military heroes are important because if they were successful, then the end that's attained justified the means that were used.
These heroes are almost a literary type in rabbinic literature, and Bar Kokhba fits the bill. Thus, despite his eventual sin, the legends place Bar Kokhba among the mightiest heroes of Israel. But this divine strength, comparable to that of the Greek Heracles, could so easily become a curse. Bar Kokhba's overconfidence in his own ability leads him to ignore the fact that the true source of his strength is God. The result is that when there is simply a suggestion that Rabbi Elazar could be considering surrender, Bar Kokhba kills him with the force of one kick. It is suggested that this not only leads to Bar Kokhba's own downfall, but also to the downfall of Batar and the loss of the war as a form of divine retribution. It is interesting that, in the story, it is the pagan emperor, Hadrian, who comments that if God had not killed him, who else would have been capable of doing so? The Jerusalem Talmud and the Midrash Lamentations both tell a second, much shorter story. Within it, Rabbi Akiba cites a passage from Numbers 24:17, which states, "A star shall step forth from Jacob." Rabbi Akiba interpreted this as Bar Kokhba and proclaimed him the King Messiah, only for another rabbi to state, "Grass will grow from your jaws, and the Son of David will still not have come." Thus, while Bar Kokhba might be a mighty hero of Israel, he is also a false Messiah. We spoke to Ivor Weintraub to give some more insight into the importance of Messianism in Judaism.
The rabbis in the Talmud, in the book of Gittin, which is one of the books of the Talmud, also refers to the Bar Kokhba revolt. And although it doesn't refer specifically to the revolt, it refers to the revolt, the reason the revolt happened and failed in allegorical terms, as I've said, but refers to Bar Kokhba as Bar Kokhba, that is a liar or a falsehood, because he was and proved to be, so far as the rabbis were concerned, a false Messiah. As the Messiah hasn't come yet, he doesn't have a physical role in Judaism. He has a spiritual role in Judaism. The ultimate end of man and the redemption of man is dependent upon the coming of the Messiah. If he fails, he cannot be the Messiah, which is why Akiva was wrong and Bar Kokhba was not the Messiah. The thing to look out for is false messiahs. We've had too many of those. So the importance of the Messiah cannot be overstated.
This picture of Bar Kokhba as a false Messiah, then, is a product of the memory of failure. It's hard to pin down exactly when rabbinic literature was written, as it was a collaborative effort across many centuries. But it's rather safe to assume that the memory of the revolt, its failure, and the misfortune it brought the Jewish people was still raw when the rabbis were recording it. There is thus an element of blame in the rabbinic image of Bar Kokhba, tempered only by his military might and bravery. This is encapsulated in his name. Rabbi Zalman told us more.
Bar Kokhba itself, his name, is an interesting one. The Talmud refers to him as Bar Kokhba. Okay? And there are writings based on that argue that interpret Bar Kokhba to mean a man of falsehoods. because the Hebrew word kazav means a lie. Okay? A lot of the archaeological evidence of the history of Bar Kokhba more recently suggests his name was actually Ben Kokhba, with a samach rather than a zayin, so a S sound rather than a Z sound. So the Talmudic name that we attribute to him, Kokhba with a Z, the historical assumption now, Kokhba with an S. Bar Kokhba is a play on a name which seems to be associated with Rabbi Akiva quoting from the Tanakh, from the Bible, referring to him as the Messiah. Darach Kochav miYaakov, a star will emerge from Jacob. So Bar Kokhba, the star, meaning the king, the leader, the hope, etc. But it's certain that in Jewish tradition, in the Talmud, and in interpretation of the Talmud, it's understood that he deviated from what is considered to be a classic within commitment to Jewish thought. In fact, he was said to associate his power, his might, and his ability to succeed as a very personal ability, without a reflection on of a higher power guiding him, that would give him the ability to succeed. He became too self-centered, assumed his might was purely his own physical ability and his own intelligence, and that was seen as a sin that caused his downfall.
Historian Lionel Cochrane suggested that Jewish historical thought, right up until the 16th century, was structured around 3 points: Israel's sacred relationship with God, rabbinic authority and how it had been passed down, and the coming of the Messiah. Within this framework of ideas, medieval writers used the Bar Kokhba story as an episode in the history of that sacred relationship and within discussions of messiahs. By the 16th century, while much of this discussion was continued, new features were emerging in this discussion.
But first, let's look to the historical context that facilitated 16th century Jewish discussion of Bar Kokhba. Jewish people were once again being persecuted, especially in the Mediterranean. At the end of the 15th century, Portuguese King John II deported Jewish children in order to re-educate them, and in 1492, the Alhambra decree forcibly expelled Jews from Spain. At the beginning of the 16th century, Italian King Emmanuel III baptized large numbers of Jews by force. Portuguese Jewish converts, known as conversos, were slaughtered by mobs in 1506 and the 1520s, and the Portuguese Inquisition reached full authority by 1544, targeting the converso population.
The 16th century was a dangerous time for the Jewish communities of the Spanish, Portuguese and Italian regions. It comes as no surprise then that some in those communities were beginning to doubt their own faith. Hundreds of years of attack from Christians, both physical and ideological, appears to have weakened Jewish resolve. Christian polemicists were using Jewish texts to prove that Jesus had in fact been the Messiah, and Jews were becoming vulnerable to the idea that God had abandoned them.
Isaac Abravanel sought to change that. Born in 1437, Abravanel was a Jewish leader, royal advisor and writer who lived through the Spanish expulsion. In 1497, Abravanel wrote Salvations of His Anointed, in which he collected rabbinic passages on eschatological subjects, the dealings of the end of times and the final judgment, dealing with questions of whether the Messiah had already come, whether he was divine, and what Jews would need to do with the Torah. It became something of a handbook, and Jews used Abravanel's texts in order to defend their position against the Christians in polemical attacks. In order to prove, both to his Jewish community and to the Christians who claimed Jesus was the Messiah, that it was impossible for the Messiah to have already come, thereby giving Jews back their messianic hope, Abravanel classified history into 3 time periods. The first, which ended in 469 CE, was a period of messianic impossibility. The second was only a period of messianic possibility if Israel repented of all of its sins. And the third and last period was of messianic certainty.
By this, Abravanel, for all intents and purposes, proved that Jesus could not possibly have been the Messiah, as he lived and died in the period of messianic impossibility. Thus, Abravanel was giving back some of that hope, that messianic expectation, back to the Jews. But how does this tie back in with Bar Kokhba? The story of Bar Kokhba provided some problems for Abravanel. Abravanel believed in the authority of the sages, but in rabbinic texts, Rabbi Akiba claimed that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. This could potentially undermine not only the authority of rabbinic teachings for Abravanel, but also Abravanel's theory that the period in which Bar Kokhba lived and died was a period of messianic impossibility, which Akiba should surely have known. As such, Abravanel takes some time in Salvations to explain how the Bar Kokhba story does not, in fact, go against his theories. Abravanel comes up with two possibilities. The first is that the miraculous military successes that Bar Kokhba won were so miraculous that Rabbi Akiba believed that God had hastened the end of the first period to make Bar Kokhba his Messiah. Rabbi Akiba, though he was wrong, had such a yearning for the salvation of God, something which occurs with every wise-hearted man who thinks and believes what his soul yearns and longs to be true, that it did not occur to him that they were living in a period of messianic impossibility. Abravanel's second theory was that Bar Kokhba was a different kind of Messiah. Kabbalistic thinking held that there were two kinds of Messiahs, the Davidic and the Josephite. The Davidic Messiah was a king Messiah, someone who would lead the Jews in politics and religion. The Josephite Messiah was a warrior Messiah. He would come before the Davidic, and he would die in battle. Thus, Abravanel theorized that Rabbi Akiba believed Bar Kokhba to be the battle axe of the Holy One, concerned with war and vengeance alone. This second theory appears to be the one that Abravanel holds most by. But both of these theories allow for Abravanel's messianic periods, as well as upholding the authority of the sages. It was a psychological, not a doctrinal mistake that was made. Akiba was essentially projecting, something which Abravanel holds most wise men to do. And thus, while he was incorrect in suggesting that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, he was not inherently wrong to have done so. So what is the 16th century image of Bar Kokhba? For Abravanel, he was still a false Messiah, but he was beginning to lose some of the negative association he started with. For Abravanel, there was only one reason why Bar Kokhba was not the Messiah, and that was the time he lived in. Every other aspect of him fit the bill. Bar Kokhba was a man of intense military success, things Abravanel believed were historical fact, as he cites his sources as Roman history books, though we don't know which ones he looked at. Abravanel was also using Bar Kokhba in his story in a new way, as a polemical story, to prove his opponents wrong. Previously, the Bar Kokhba story had been used by Jews to teach other Jews the rights and wrongs of religion. But Abravanel was using his story in this book, which was essentially a handbook for the Jews, to arm them with arguments against the Christians who tried to prove them wrong. Abravanel also introduces Bar Kokhba in a new light, as a symbol of vengeance. The emphasis put on Bar Kokhba's military achievements and legendary strength suggests something of the mindset of Abravanel and his contemporaries. Perhaps Abravanel wanted divine vengeance for the way his community had been treated. Likely, he wanted to give his community a figure through which they could gain hope, both messianic and in terms of resistance. Abravanel wasn't the only Jewish writer using the Bar Kokhba story in the 16th century. In fact, the 16th century saw a large increase in the number of Jewish works being produced, something which historians attribute to the need to reflect on their long history of suffering, more important than ever, in the wake of their recent misfortunes in Spain and Portugal.
The image of Bar Kokhba, then, reflected the persecutions and a Jewish desire to figure out the messianic question. It is for this reason that Samuel Uske and Yosef HaKohen writing in 1553 and 1575 respectively, chose to include the Bar Kokhba story in their histories of Jewish suffering.
We also see Bar Kokhba being shown in a new light, as a symbol of vengeance. Abravanel's portrayal of Bar Kokhba as the battle axe concerned only with war and vengeance demonstrates the pain that these Jews no doubt felt. That the story of a brave warrior fighting to free his people with the power of God became popular in a time of Jewish oppression is surely no coincidence.
And it is this same idea that carries us through to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Jews living in the Russian Empire at this time were in a similar state of oppression to the Jews of the 16th century Spain and Portugal. Alexander III ascended the throne following the assassination of his father, Alexander II, in March 1881. The new Tsar abandoned his father's plans for constitutional reforms and instead chose to further his own journey into autocracy. In the wake of the assassination, new policies of legal repression were put in place. Alexander III's government viewed the Jews as the cause of abnormal relations between Christians and Jews and thought that they were parasitical. Before this, efforts had been taken in the Pale of Settlement, where the majority of Russian Jews lived, to push the Jews into productivity in the realms of manufacturing and agriculture. There were also economic attacks on the areas the Russian government did not want Jews working in, such as petty trade and alcohol manufacturing. The Russian government justified this with the claim that the Jews were to blame for the poverty and intoxication of the peasantry. However, between 1881 and 1921, this escalated, and 3 great waves of anti-Jewish pogroms spread, resulting in great death and destruction within the Jewish communities. The so-called May Laws of 1882, which temporarily forbade Jews in the Pale of Settlement from settling anywhere new, from being issued mortgages, and from doing business on Sundays and other Christian holidays, were the backdrop for a new retelling of the Bar Kokhba story. Emerging from this period of oppression and devastation was a Jewish playwright named Abraham Goldfaden. He wrote a play in 1882, aptly titled Bar Kokhba, a musical retelling of the rabbinic stories mixed with the romantic style of the period and the determination of Goldfaden to give new hope to his Jewish community. Why did Goldfaden choose, at this difficult point in history, to retell the story of an ancient Jewish military hero? And how does this retelling of the legend develop the image of Bar Kokhba? Bar Kokhba, in Goldfaden's retelling, is a heroic figure, much like in previous literature. Just as Hadrian eulogizes his strength, just as Abravanel calls him battle axe, so too does Goldfaden present him as a heroic Jewish figure, strong, courageous, and relentless. But Goldfaden presents this traditional image within the theatrical style of the period he wrote in. In an attempt to adapt the story to his 19th century audience, Goldfaden adds in a character, a woman named Dina, who is Rabbi Elazar's daughter and is betrothed to Bar Kokhba. This love story takes a central position in the plot, though it is non-existent in the Jewish tradition. Goldfaden also chooses to do away with the messianic element to the plot, apart from a brief reference to Bar Kokhba's title as King Messiah. In doing so, he neglects to include Rabbi Akiba, as he was essential to the messianic element. Goldfaden wanted to create a hero which would embody his contemporary ideals. Bar Kokhba is a masterpiece through which he addresses his community, a 19th century hero cast back 2,000 years in history. But why Bar Kokhba, and why then in 1882? Goldfaden had a goal, as all playwrights do. What was it he wanted Bar Kokhba to convey? The Roman forces clearly represented the contemporary Tsarist government, and Goldfaden was making a statement against the oppression he and his community were currently facing. But it goes deeper than this. While on the face of it, the conflict of this play is between the Jews and the authoritarian regime that wished to oppress them, the true conflict of this play is between the rabbinic forces, who wish to assimilate and give in to the demands of their overlords, and the rebellious forces, who wish to unite as a nation and overthrow the bondage of their oppression. In the play, Rabbi Elazar represents those contemporary rabbis that, in Goldfaden's mind, were not doing enough for their community, and wished to accept their current status as punishment for their collective sin. So, while originally the rabbis used this story to critique Bar Kokhba, here Goldfading is using it to criticize the rabbis. Unsurprisingly, the play did not go down well with the enemies of Yiddish theatre. The Orthodox and Jewish elite of St. Petersburg argued that Goldfading was inspiring sedition. In September of 1883, possibly as a direct response to this play, and UK's a Russian decree banned Yiddish theatre in Russia. Suffering continued for the Jews of the Russian Empire, and the pogroms and institutionalized anti-Semitism in Russia was just the start of what would be the European Jews' most harrowing century yet.
First reference, I suppose, if you're looking at 20th century nationalism, Bar Kokhba had a significant influence on Vladimir Zeev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was one of the leaders of the Zionist movement. He was present in London during the First World War. From 1915, when he came from Egypt to Britain, had a considerable influence, if not the main influence, on the forming of the Jewish Legion, the 38th to 40th Battalions of the British Fusiliers, formed a Jewish youth movement known as Batar. Following on, it became one of the strands of revolutionary Zionism and Judaism during the 1930s in Palestine, and had an enormous following worldwide amongst Jewish youth. It followed on from that the extreme Zionists such as Avraham Stern, Yitzhak Shamir, the leaders of the Irgun and Lehi, fighters for the freedom of Israel, looked upon Bar Kokhba, as well as following on from the Maccabees, as wonderful examples of revolutionary Jews who were prepared to stand up and fight the oppressor.
The Zionist movement gained considerable pace after World War II, and Israel was recognised officially on the 14th of May 1948, after the 1947 UN partition agreement had sparked civil war in the British Mandate of Palestine. Despite its international recognition, the status of Israel has still been combated by Arab nations surrounding them, such as Syria, Egypt and Jordan, who joined the Palestinians in the civil war against Israel. The War of 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973 demonstrate the ongoing military campaigns which have continued into the present day with political tensions between the countries. As a result, modern memory and identity in Israel has been adapted through their socio-political needs, with Bar Kokhba being used to construct a new face of nationalism in the face of these challenges.
The story of Bar Kokhba in Israel primarily started in 1960, when Yigal Yadin conducted a large-scale archaeological excavation in the caves of the Judean desert. On his expedition, coins, clothes and documents signed by Bar Kokhba himself were rediscovered, bringing the legend of Bar Kokhba into public light once again. The findings held great significance to the public and government, who used the opportunity to legitimize the new state of Israel and establish a strong link between its heritage and Simon Bar Kokhba. The findings were displayed at the home of the second president of Israel, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, where Bar Kokhba was referred to as Nasi, the Hebrew word for president.
Bar Kokhba had been brought into a factual light where a narrative could be placed beside the legend of his story. By sharing titles with legendary Jewish figures, Israel has been attempting to create a strong link with the revolt and the positive connotations surrounding Bar Kokhba's strong military abilities. Israel has been validating their heritage, tracing the lineage of their right to the land back to antiquity. During the 20th century, Bar Kokhba's image has been associated with strength, establishing a nationalist spirit in the face of the challenges to their sovereignty. In traditional rabbinic sources, Bar Kokhba has been seen as a figure with great leadership and exceptional strength. However, his forfeiture of divine intervention caused the eventual failure of his revolt. The current ideology of Zionism overlooks the shortcomings in his character and instead focuses on the strong militaristic abilities which he used in supporting the Jewish state against Roman occupation. This idealised version of Bar Kokhba's story can be seen surrounding the War of 1967, where his image was closely related to the IDF as well as individual soldiers within the army.
Meir Hazion was one soldier who received this comparison. Described as the elite of the elite, Moshe Dayan spoke highly of him, likening Hazion to what he thought was the greatest Jewish fighter for the past 1800 years, the legendary Simon Bar Kokhba. In this comparison, Zion is shown to have extraordinary strength as a captain in the Israeli army in the face of hostilities from Arab forces in Jordan, Syria and Egypt, as Bar Kokhba had proven in the face of Roman occupation.
In the present day, Bar Kokhba and his revolt is still remembered with an idealised version of the reality of the revolt. Lag BaOmer is one holiday in the Jewish calendar, which is remembered by some as a celebration of Bar Kokhba. By happy coincidence, the day we spoke with Rabbi Zalman was also the day of Lag BaOmer. He spoke to us about the origins of the Jewish holiday.
How is the story of Bar Kokhba commemorated today? You mean in the modern era, but today is a very, very relevant reference because today is the 18th of Iyar, which, according to some opinions, is actually the main day in the Jewish calendar for the commemoration of Bar Kokhba. Okay, but coming from the perspective that I'm coming from, I'm going to take a different view. You see very clearly, if you look in the background to this Jewish festival, that its commemoration in relation to Bar Kokhba is a much more recent concept related to modern Zionism. So, just a little bit of background. One of the main students of Rabbi Akiva was Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. He passed away on the 18th of Iyar, which is also the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer. So we're now 33 days after the second day of Passover as we head towards the next Jewish festival, the festival of Shavuot, of weeks. And he asked that the day of his passing be commemorated as a great day, a day in recognition of his great achievements. Associated with that, it became a tradition to light bonfires representing the light of spirituality that this Rabbi Shimon introduced to the world, specifically as the concepts of the Zohar are attributed to him. So Rabbi Shimon is associated with a great light of energy, of divine, of spiritual purpose that he introduced to the world, hence the tradition of lighting bonfires. More recently, a narrative of Bar Kokhba seems to have been brought into the equation as part of modern Zionism, associating the era of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Again, he was a student of Rabbi Akiva's association with Bar Kokhba, that whole era together. So there's obviously great links, and modern Zionism has made this day also a lot about ecology, nurturing the land. It's harvest time in Israel, so it makes sense why these things would evolve in this way. And the bonfires seem to be mimicked on the more spiritual bonfires that come from the more religious communities who are commemorating Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, but it's been adopted in a wider context, being associated with ecology and determination, thus linking this date of Lag BaOmer to Bar Kokhba.
Rabbi Benjamin Lau and Yael Zerubbabel have both explained this, saying that Israelis saw the image of Bar Kokhba as one of strength in the face of Roman subjugation and a symbol of a fighting spirit. Israel therefore finds itself keen to align itself with the image of Bar Kokhba, which they regard as freedom from hostile influences such as the surrounding Arab countries.
The tradition of lighting bonfires has also been reinterpreted to establish different narratives, although along the same positive theme of a strong, militaristic image surrounding Bar Kokhba. Israeli textbooks, for example, have described the activity of kindling bonfires as a celebration after a military victory against the Romans. Former Chief in Staff and archaeologist Yigal Yadin has reasserted this, saying that whereas the Roman Empire diminished, Jewish communities have rebuilt to reclaim what he regards as their ancestral home. In either case, the image of Bar Kokhba has been adapted into a Zionist narrative, which promotes Israeli defense of their homeland and an eventual victory, while remaining ignorant to the ultimate failure of his rebellion.
This holiday has also been integrated with the Israeli Defense Forces. Established in 1948 for the defense of their homeland, the need for a figurehead to embody the fighting spirit of the nation was needed. Who better than Simon Bar Kokhba, the legendary Jewish fighter, to embody this spirit? Yadin's discovery in 1960 came at a valuable time in history, when conflict in the 1960s and 70s meant that Israel were fighting for their future and their homeland. To integrate Bar Kokhba's courageous fighting spirit with the Israeli military, the Gad and the Youth Programme aligned their insignia of a bow and arrow with the Lag BaOmer tradition of archery, relating the youth military with Simon Bar Kokhba. Recently, this connection has become deeper. In 2004, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs marked the holiday of Lag BaOmer as also the celebration of the Israeli Defense Forces and the reserves. The now deep-rooted connection between Bar Kokhba's military abilities and the Israeli and Zionist culture have now been linked even closer, effectively using Bar Kokhba as the figurehead of the military. The image of Bar Kokhba has thus been heavily linked with the Israeli state. Inspired by the Zionist ideology which overlooked the shortcomings in his character, Israel has focused on the positive aspects of the revolt and the strong military abilities which are displayed at the early stages of the revolt. These positive characteristics were crucial in developing Israeli nationalism in the face of hostilities from Arab nations which surrounded them, establishing a close relationship with the IDF to push forward a strong, militarized public image. By means of doing so, public holidays such as Lag BaOmer have been modified to consider how Bar Kokhba can be integrated into national celebration through differing interpretations of traditions.
Simon Bar Kokhba has proven a difficult figure to pin down, both in literature and in history. The image of him and the revolt he led has been the source of much controversy from the time of the revolt right up until the present day. We have seen Bar Kokhba as a sinner, a liar, and a false messiah, but also as a hero with the potential for messiahship. While for modern mainstream Judaism, Bar Kokhba and his revolt do not hold huge significance, by tracing his image throughout time, we have been able to record key events in Jewish history. As history progressed, the perceived need for nationalism in the face of oppression made Bar Kokhba a key figure to rally behind. Even without the political implications, his story is one which generates great interest for us as historians. It is a story that continues to be relatable, no matter who you are, where, or even when you live. And to some, he remains a hero, as someone who stood up to oppression and died fighting for his people.